Today we're talking frost weapons and Fenris, with an overview of how to get a hardy force of space wolves off the ground in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking space wolves, and we're going to be going over some of the practicalities of getting together a hardy force of space vikings and charging them to a glorious saga on the tabletops of the 41st millennium. We'll talk about why you might want to collect space wolves, some thoughts on buying 40k miniatures and planning an army in general, some thoughts on first purchases for the space wolves and the many different combat patrollers available for the space marines, a few ideas for expanding an army, and finishing up with one idea for a space wolf list. There's a whole load of stuff to get your teeth and claws into, so let's jump in. So first up, why might you choose a Space Wolves army in Warhammer 40k? Lore-wise, they're one of the more headstrong chapters that doesn't really play by the rules, and have quite a fun and refreshing outlook on life compared with much of the Imperium just doing what they need to do and doing it effectively, even to the extent where it draws them into conflict with some of the more dogmatic aspects of the Imperium. The Space Wolves are a Space Marine chapter based on Fenris. They've got a strong Nordic, Viking and wolf themes going on in the army. Lots of fun touches like a love for axes, runic armour, wolf heads and talismans going on across quite a lot of their army, and actual wolf cavalry and werewolf units that you can field in game. Talking of werewolves, they are afflicted by the Curse of the Wolfen, some of their chapter devolving into feral beasts as time passes, a dark secret of the chapter that can sometimes still help them out on the field of battle, having savage devolved space marines tearing the heart out of the enemy. In battle they tend to employ vicious close combat tactics. Space wolves tend to be happiest sending large amounts of heavily armed and armoured warriors into the midst of the foe. Fairly tough elite infantry units with shields often are the order of the day. Models wise, as a Space Marine army they do have a very extensive support of all the kits from the Space Marine range, though I must admit a lot of it doesn't feel enormously dedicated to the Space Wolves and is a bit more generic in feel for most of say the new Primaris kits. Still though, it's not too hard to customise a bit with a decent paint scheme and maybe some bits plundered from other kits, and you can have a very wolfy feeling army if you want to. As well as the generic range, Space Wolves are relatively well supported for faction specific models, though most of their unique units like Thunderwolves, Wolfen, and their various unique units like Wolfguard and Grey Hunters, several of those tend to be at least slightly older 40k plastic kits, though still good sources for bits and spares. Likely at some point in the future they will be getting a Primaris style upgrade, something similar to what the Black Templars got with a whole bunch of new Primaris shiny kits for them. But at the moment we really don't know how long that's going to be before that gets there. It could potentially be many years away. In general though, very decent options, though there are some older resin relics among the range. In game, as per the lore, they do tend to function as a savagely brutal assault force with powerful characters and some very dangerous squads when they've got their full buffs up. Their chapter tactic will give them +1 to hit when they charge in, and their combat doctrine's Savage Fury gives them extra 6s to hit in melee. As well as the generic options, they've got Wolfguard, Wolfen and Thunderwolves, all very hard-hitting elite Space Marine units, and they're well supported with some good psychic powers and some nice relics such as the Armour of Ross. Currently in game, I'd say that Space Wolves are a kind of mid-tier army. Marines in general are sort of okay, and Space Wolves are doing alright out of the Marine factions. I would bear in mind that a new Space Marine Codex might well be coming out either later in 2022 or early 23, and that might change how the core of the army functions quite a bit, and will most likely bring another power boost. Finally, price-wise, they are relatively cheap to play for Warhammer 40k. Space Marines in general are an elite army with a ton of discount options, and both of those things are good for getting an army on the table for not that much money. Speaking of which, in these start collecting type videos, I do tend to try and touch on buying miniatures in 40k and the different ways that you can do so. Direct from Games Workshop is one of the more easiest and reliable ways, though it's usually the most expensive as well. You could think about local gaming stores, which typically tend to offer discounts around the world, usually in the region of 10 to 20%, and one example of a discount store is Element Games in the UK. I've got them linked down in the video description if you're interested. Any purchases made through there also help support Auspex Tactics as well. There's plenty of alternate options available though, just give it a Google search. Otherwise, Space Wolves have been around for a really long time. There's generally quite a good turnover on the secondary market for them. You'll get people selling everything from individual units to entire armies for a decent discount on eBay, and it can save you a lot of time and effort as well, although obviously quality can be variable. Finally, 3D printing is much more of a thing these days as well. It can be particularly nice for customizing armies to have a bit more of, say, a wolfy type aesthetic. I've seen some people make some pretty cool alternate wolf helms for Space Marine forces, and it can be nice if you just want some certain custom parts or weapons. I've seen people with some quite nice storm shields for Space Wolves, or different axes or combat weapons. Moving on to planning an army. The first thing I do is get acquainted with the Space Wolves and how they function, and picking up either Codex Space Marines or Codex Space Wolves wouldn't be the worst start. We'll get onto the rules later, but certainly the Space Wolves Codex has a decent amount of lore on the faction, plus some miniature galleries and the unique unit rules. It wouldn't be the worst place to start if you want to get a bit more educated on the faction. Otherwise, for game rules besides the books themselves, there's Battlescribe, Warhapedia, and the Warhammer app. All of those are pretty decent rules resources, and can help you with a bit of theory crafting and list building. Tabletop Simulator is the Steam game with the extensive 40k modding community, and it can allow you to try out models in the digital world before you commit to them, or you could also just proxy things on the table. And of course, there's a whole ton of content here on YouTube as well. I have made a few Space Wolf videos myself, including an army overview about a year back. Admittedly, a few things have changed since then, but the core of the army still functions pretty similar. You can also think about reaching out to people on Discord, Reddit, or Facebook. Just joining up to, say, any Space Wolf or Space Marine related groups can just allow you to imbibe a fair bit of knowledge and people's questions just by reading, and it's quite a good position to ask people if you've got a few silly questions. Otherwise, once you're a little bit more familiar with what the Space Wolves do and what their lore is, you can make a few decisions as to what way you want to take your army. With Space Marines, there's always the Primaris versus Firstborn debate, Primaris being the bigger augmented Space Marines, and basically likely represent the future for the faction. Space Wolves, I must admit, are in a bit of an awkward spot at the moment. Primaris models are nice, but don't have a whole load of theme towards the Space Wolf army. Though with Games Workshop slowly updating the Space Marine range, it's certainly not impossible that they might start to phase out some of the older Firstborn kits as the years go on. It does leave the Space Wolves in a bit of a tricky spot, as basically all of the cool and characterful stuff tends to be Firstborn, barring a few notable exceptions, and I think I'd be most tempted to take a bit of a middle strategy, some Primaris and some Firstborn, and see what the future brings in terms of new releases for them, and be prepared to adapt eventually. Otherwise, when getting an army together, I'd think about painting up a practice model in a test colour scheme. Something like an Intercessor or a Grey Hunter I think will be quite a good start, just some generic troops that you've got a reasonable chance of using in multiple games going forward. Space Wolves are really quite a common colour scheme to see people attempting in painting tutorials on YouTube. If you're unsure as to how exactly best to get the paint on the models, it could be well worth just giving that a search on YouTube and seeing how people execute a quick and effective colour scheme. Could be fun as well to think of the bases. Space Wolves are quite a good one for doing snow effects if you want to. Depends how much effort you want to put into basing the models. Finally, when thinking about how an army is going to get built up, you could think about whether you're going to be theming your list to anything, maybe to lore or a game plan. Generally, I think the vast majority of Space Wolf armies are going to want a lot of melee in the list, but I think they're one of the factions where you don't really have to go all in if you don't want to. Make sure you've got a decent chunk of melee, and then you can still support it with the powerful Space Marine generic ranged options. Otherwise, for army themes, some of the common ones that I've seen people try to go for Space Wolves are going very wolf heavy with units like Thunderwolves and Wolfen, mass dreadnought armies led by Bjorn the Fell-Handed and Murderfang, or going for more elite builds like leaning heavy on Wolfguard, either regular ones converted from Vanguard veterans with jump packs or heavy Terminator forces. You could also think about theming a list to one of the great companies out there. A lot of those have their own particular themes and ways that they like to fight in battle, such as the Iron Wolves with their unusually mechanized Space Wolf forces. Plenty of fun options to go for, and you could certainly make a bit more of a balanced list. I'd say in the early stages of collecting an army, you could think about drafting out a 2,000 point list for an ideal end goal. It doesn't matter if plans change by the time that you get to it, but at least it could give you some sort of idea as to which way you might be headed. Moving on, let's talk about first purchases. First up, starting with rules and the codex. Slightly annoyingly, Space Marine codexes are laid out with the core codex Space Marines and then the Codex Space Wolf supplement. The core codex gives you the majority of rules for actually playing Space Marines in general, and is arguably the more important purchase. But a lot of the fun and themed Space Wolf units are from Codex Space Wolves, so in general you'll probably want to be picking up both eventually. Again, putting new collectors in a slightly awkward spot is the news that Codex Space Marines will likely be being replaced within the year. It does mean that if you pick this up now, it'll have a fairly short shelf life, as when the new book comes out, the rules will be redone. Still though, in the meantime, it might not be the easiest to play the faction without the book. Might just be a one to keep abreast of rumours, and when it sounds like the new book might be coming out kind of shortly, might be worth putting it on eBay to get a bit of money back. Otherwise, besides the core rules, Games Workshop also has some FAQs, errata and balance updates. A fair few of the points costs from Codex Space Wolves have gone down a bit since the Codex came out. They've got a digital download for new points that came out in July 22, as well as the balanced data slate adding Armour of Contempt for better saves to your power armour, and FAQs for both the Codex and the supplement book, those ones more just to resolve some niggling rules questions with the way that the codexes work. I'll link those bits down in the video description. Otherwise, for getting models on the table, I think my first port of call when collecting a Space Marine army will be to look at the Space Marine combat patrols, and not necessarily just the Space Wolves one either. They're slightly discounted sets that get you a fair amount of miniatures onto the table, so a pretty good way to start a force in one go and then build up with other units that you like. As well as this, I think early on when collecting an army, I'd be tempted to pick up any units that either really inspire you model-wise to go to the faction. Say for example, if you really like some Wolfguard Terminators, nothing wrong with adding in a box of those early. Or are units that you think that you're just going to use very regularly in game? Maybe things like troops like Bloodclaws or Grey Hunters that you think you'd want to include in every single list, or perhaps some sturdy fire support things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts. Talking of discount combat patrols though, here's Combat Patrol Space Wolves, £90, $150 or €120, or a bit less if you go through a retailer like Element Games linked in the video description. As a deal from Games Workshop, it isn't the worst. The individual units, if you bought them all separately, would cost you around about £118-ish, and you also get a couple of Space Wolf upgrade sprues for the Primaris Marines, a few quite cool things like Space Wolf shoulder pads, and a few little themes and talismans. They are quite cool for making scattered models just feel a little bit more Space Wolves. For just the models, it amounts to around about a 25% discount on buying the kits separately. It's certainly not nothing, but it's certainly not completely outstanding compared with other Combat Patrol boxes. The box is led by a Primaris Battle Leader, the chap at the front there with the axe and the wolf pelt, currently one of 2 dedicated Primaris miniatures for the Space Wolves so far, and he is quite a nice little characterful model. As well as that, you get 10 Intercessors, a pretty good generic Primaris troops choice, pretty reasonable to field in the Space Wolves to hold some objectives and still punch a bit in the fight phase, and then the rest of the box is a bit Phobos heavy, a unit of 5 Reavers that with the upgrade sprues can be fielded as Space Wolves Hounds of Morkai, their dedicated Psyker hunting unit, and then an Invicta tactical warsuit, the Primaris Scout and Infiltration Walker. I'd say both the Hounds of Morkai and the Invicta are kind of okay, though not particularly outstanding or optimal. But I think that overall, once the upgrade sprues are included, it's not really the worst start to a Space Wolves army, if you do want to go down a bit more of a Primaris heavy route. Otherwise though, as mentioned, there really are quite a lot of other Space Marine Combat Patrol boxes out there. They cost the same as the Space Wolves one and are around about 500 points worth of models. There's the more Phobos armor heavy and Spec Ops Space Marine one, the Death Watch one with aggressors, intercessors and a couple of characters, the Dark Angels one with the Redemptor Dreadnought, Inceptors, Intercessors and Chaplain, and the Blood Angels one with the Impulsor, Intercessors, Incursors, Aggressors and Librarian. I'd say for Space Wolves, perhaps the Death Watch one is particularly suboptimal as it contains an Apothecary which you can't field in Space Wolves. Probably the Dark Angels or the Blood Angels ones are the most interesting other ones. The Dark Angels containing a Redemptor Dreadnought is pretty nice, I think. They are really quite a good fire-based unit right now. And for the Blood Angels one, I do really quite like that one. Just about every one of those units is usable. Space Wolves have good psychic powers, and I think that they are perhaps one of the better units for using the Repulsor, transporting some dangerous combat elites towards the foe. Even the aggressors are perhaps a bit more relevant, +1 to hit and exploding 6s to hit in combat make Power Fist armed units that bit more dangerous. Otherwise, for getting a Space Wolf collection off the ground, for Space Wolf bits I'd be tempted to pick up either the Grey Hunters or Bloodclaws sprues. For the money that they cost, they actually come with really quite a lot of firstborn models. Particularly the Bloodclaws, getting 60 Marines for a single box is something that was a relic from Games Workshop's past, even if they are quite old sculpts. In any case, even after building the models, you'll have a fair amount of decent bits left over, and it might well be worth not actually building every single one of the models, and then using the parts over more generic Space Marine kits, things like Devastators to make long fangs, or most of the more bespoke Primaris kits. As an alternative to the Combat Patrol boxes as well, you could think about the 40k starter sets. Both the Recruit and Elite sets are pretty reasonable choices for the Space Wolves, I think. They generally tend to be quite combat orientated, which is good for the Wolves. The characters are both pretty usable, and they come with a whole bunch of Necrons which you could potentially either swap with someone else or split the box. From there, presuming you've got a small and functional army on the go, I think about getting in a few combat patrol games to get a bit of a feel for how the units work and what sort of ways you might want to expand. In armies, you generally want to have a bit of a mix between units that can hold objectives and focus on winning the mission, and the units that are going to go out and just absolutely wreck the opponent's face and destroy their army. Generally, Space Wolf lists get on pretty well with any melee capable troops. Assault intercessors are quite popular, as are blood claws, as they basically feel like discount assault intercessors but still get the same amount of attacks on the charge. Intercessors are quite a nice mix for maybe more backfield objectives, being able to do a bit of shooting as well as fight okay. And both the Phobos troops units tend to be fairly popular in Space Wolves armies. Extra bodies on the midfield objectives right from the get-go, plus are also okay in melee when buffed. For damage dealers, the Space Wolves have really quite a lot of options. Basically, any Space Marine elite infantry units that can hit hard in combat will do you well. Wolfguard and Wolfguard Terminators are both pretty efficient. People seem to like fielding Wolfguard with jump packs basically made from Vanguard veterans and charging them into combat with Storm Shields and maybe Thunder Hammers or Lightning Claws. The Wolf units, the Wolfen and the Thunder Wolves, are both okay. In general, they're both quite hard hitting, particularly the Wolfen, though maybe not all that sturdy when it comes to taking return fire. The half-werewolf look of the Wolfen is certainly unique, although I think it does divide opinions somewhat. Some people like the models, but I've met quite a lot of people who aren't the biggest fans. Otherwise, long fangs can be a pretty interesting option. I've seen a lot of people use drop pods with them in, and using their stratagem that allows them to ignore modifiers. That means that you could have a unit with a bunch of grav cannons or multi-melters piling out of a pod and laying into the enemy with pretty maximal effect. And you'd also be wanting some characters to lead the army. A lot of people like to use Jump Pack Rune Priest or Wolf Lords. Rune Priests have access to a whole ton of decent psychic powers, getting the Assault Doctrine early, making the enemy fight last, or providing cover nearby. And Wolf Lords are nice fighty options, good with Saga of the Hunter, and maybe something like the Armour of Rust to make enemies fight last. Beyond the Fell-Handed is quite a fun and popular choice as well. Big, fighty, and character protected, and a Dreadnought. And Chaplains in general tend to work pretty well in a Space Wolf army as well. Getting 4 reroll hits combined with their exploding hits on 6s means that they can be crazily threatening. Otherwise, just about any strong generic option out of the Space Marine Codex tends to be good. Redemptor Dreadnoughts tend to be quite popular in Space Wolf armies for firepower, Eradicators for burning down some tanks, and Blade Guard Veterans are quite a nice foot-slogging Primaris unit that can also deal some crazy damage with layered Space Wolf buffs. Finally, just to finish up, here's one list that I mentioned on the channel previously. It's a slightly older list, though a very effective one, and I still think that it does a good job to showcase exactly what the Wolves of Fenris can do on the tabletop. This one was written by Jaime Paris, who used it to take first at the Warp Wanderers Invitational RTT. I had the pleasure to play against this one myself, and to make no bones about it, I got ruthlessly crushed. The list is a single battalion detachment, and it takes a Space Wolves successor chapter with Whirlwind of Rage and Born Heroes. Successor chapters are quite popular to field with Space Wolves, as you lose the heroic intervention type thing, but you can still do that on any unit for a command point, and taking these two successor chapter tactics in concert means that you can just absolutely double down on melee buffs. Whirlwind of Raged exploding 6s, and Born Heroes is +1 to hit. Then the list is led by a trio of characters, a chapter master with a jump pack, frost claws, and the Imperium sword, very fighty all in all, and big rerolls on one unit, a librarian rune priest with a jump pack, Rights of War, and the Armour of Rust. That's objective secured, some better protection, and also fights last for an enemy, and they take Murderous Hurricane and Stormcaller for some fights last and protection for the forces moving up. There's then a Primaris Chaplain on bike, a Master of Sanctity with Wise Orator and the Canticle of Hate and Catechism of Fire, a nice general purpose buffing piece, plus 4 rerolls in melee are absolutely excellent combined with double exploding 6s, which you get from Whirlwind of Rage plus the unique Doctrine, and turns out just about any Space Wolf infantry unit into a blender. Then into the squads, we've got 3 units of Wolfguard with Jump Pack, Storm Shield, and Lightning Claw, a nice general purpose kill most things type unit that aren't affected by -1 damage weapons, 2 units of 5 Blood Claws for backfield objectives, 1 unit of 5 Incursors to take midfield objectives, a Cyber Wolf for just some random annoyance threats that you could park on an objective or use to screen, and 2 units of Long Fangs with 3 Grav Cannons and a Multi-Melter, each of which also takes an Armorium Cherub, and they're both bundled into the same drop pod for a massive ranged Alpha Strike punch likely on turn 1. Quite nice that you can double fire the Multi-Melter for the Cherub if you need to, and they could be potentially getting a whole load of rerolls if they drop in aura range of the Chapter Master and maybe one of the Dreadnoughts used in Wisdom of the Ancients. Finally, speaking of which, there's 2 Redemptors and a Relic Volkite Contemptor. The Redemptors are very solid, general purpose firepower with macroplasmas and onslaught Gatling cannons. They can also certainly lend a hefty hand in melee against heavy hitters in a pinch, and the Volkite Contemptor just spams some mass mortal wound damage. A pretty reasonable target for the Chapter Master rerolls and the Chaplain buff in early turns. Overall, it is a really cool list. I think due to points changes it might be a little bit over 2,000 points now, so might just need a little bit of wiggling, dropping down something to something else, maybe one of the Redemptors to a unit of outflanking Eradicators or something, just to make the points fit a little bit better. Still though, Space Marines are looking at least fairly strong in the new Nephilim world. They do have some fairly easy secondary objectives to be going for as well. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for an intro to Space Wolves. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on getting an army of frostbitten Space Vikings functioning. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked down in the video description. The Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. If you are enjoying and would like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then feel free to check it out. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.